I'm Michael Harrison, 58, a retired Marine Corps colonel and Medal of Honor recipient. After 27 years of service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where I saved 14 lives under enemy fire, I thought I'd earned my son's respect. But at last night's family dinner, when I shared a story about my service, David rolled his eyes and said, "Dad, honestly, anyone could have done what you did." The words hit harder than any bullet I'd ever faced. My wife went silent. My daughter looked away. But what my son didn't know, what none of them knew, was the real story behind that medal. The truth about the choice I made that haunts me still, and why his words cut deeper than he could ever imagine. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down, her eyes darting between David and me. My daughter Emma, home from college for the weekend, suddenly found her salad fascinating. The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. "David," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying that warning tone I'd heard her use when the kids were younger. But David just shrugged, reaching for his water glass as if he hadn't just lobbed a grenade into our dining room. "What?" "I'm just saying. Dad always acts like he's the only one who's ever done anything brave. It's not like he single-handedly won the war." I felt my jaw tighten. 27 years of service, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Medal of Honor, and my son saw it as showboating. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need some air," I muttered, walking toward my study. "Michael, wait," Sarah called after me, but I was already closing the door behind me. The study was my sanctuary, lined with books on military history and leadership. My medals sat in a shadow box on the wall, but tonight they felt like accusations rather than honors. I slumped into my leather chair, the same one I'd sat in countless times trying to decompress after difficult missions. On my desk sat a letter, partially hidden beneath some papers. David's acceptance letter to Harvard. Full scholarship, thanks to his academic achievements, but I'd quietly supplemented his living expenses through my veterans' benefits. He had no idea. Sarah and I had agreed not to tell him, wanting him to feel proud of his accomplishments without the burden of knowing his father's. Money was involved. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years trying to provide for my family, to give them opportunities I'd never had, and my son saw me as nothing more than a glory-seeking soldier. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Michael?" Sarah stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You okay?" I gestured toward the Harvard letter. "I've been thinking about this, about what he said." Sarah sat on the arm of my chair, her hand finding my shoulder. "He's young, honey. He doesn't understand. Maybe he's right." The words came out harder than I intended. "Maybe anyone could have done what I did." "Don't." Sarah's voice was firm now. "Don't let his words diminish what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed." But as I stared at that letter, at the evidence of my son's bright future, a future I'd helped make possible, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, I'd failed at the most important mission of my life. I'd learned to lead soldiers, to make impossible decisions under fire, to save lives in combat. But I'd never learned how to reach my own son. The distance between us had grown, so gradually that I'd barely noticed it happening. When had he stopped looking at me with pride? When had my service stories become lectures instead of shared memories? Outside, I could hear David's voice, animated as he talked to Emma about his internship plans. He was passionate, driven, intelligent, everything I'd hoped he'd become. But none of that seemed to matter when we were in the same room together. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "Give him time. He'll come around." But as I sat there in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the artifacts of my military career, I wondered if time was something we were running out of. David would graduate soon, start his own life, and this chasm between us would become permanent. I picked up the Harvard letter, reading it again. His essay had been about overcoming adversity, about finding his own path despite the expectations placed on him. He'd written about wanting to make a difference in the world through law, to fight for justice in courtrooms rather than battlefields. He'd never mentioned me once in those carefully crafted paragraphs. Not as an inspiration, not as an obstacle, just silence. Complete, absolute silence. Maybe that hurt more than his words at dinner. At least anger was something. Silence was indifference, and indifference was the death of any relationship. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back under the papers. Tomorrow, I'd figure out how to bridge this gap. Tonight, I just needed to sit with the weight of my son's words and the heavier weight of my own failures as a father. I was 18 when I walked into the Marine Corps' recruiting station in downtown Pittsburgh, my father's words still ringing in my ears. "You're throwing your life away, Michael. College is your ticket out of this neighborhood, and you're choosing to play soldier instead." He'd been a steel worker for 32 years, his hands permanently stained with grease and his back bent from decades of hard labor. The mill had been his world, but he'd dreamed of something different for me. When I told him I was enlisting instead of accepting the partial scholarship to community college, he looked at me like I'd personally betrayed everything he'd worked for. "The military's for boys who can't make it any other way," he'd said, not looking up from his newspaper. "You've got brains, Michael. Use them." But sitting in that recruiting office, looking at the crisp uniforms and the photos of Marines in action, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Purpose, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez walked me through the process, his bearing straight and confident in a way that commanded respect. He spoke about honor, courage, and commitment, values that meant something beyond the paycheck-to-paycheck existence I'd watched my parents struggle with. The enlistment paper sat before me, official and intimidating. My signature looked young and uncertain next to the bold military letterhead, but I signed anyway. Michael James Harrison, committing 4 years of his life to something bigger than himself. My mother cried when I told her. Not the proud tears I'd hoped for, but the worried tears of a woman who'd watched too many neighborhood boys go off to war and come back changed, or not come back at all. This was 1983, and the memory of Vietnam still haunted families like ours. "Why can't you just be normal?" she'd asked, her voice breaking. "Get a job, find a nice girl, stay close to home?" But normal felt like suffocation. I'd grown up watching my father's dreams slowly die under the weight of bills and responsibility. He'd wanted to be a teacher once, had even started college before his own father got sick, and he had to quit to support the family. The pattern repeated itself: sacrifice, duty, and the quiet death of personal ambition. The Marines offered something different. Structure, yes, but also opportunity. A chance to prove myself, to become something more than just another kid from the South Side who'd never seen beyond the city limits. Boot camp at Paris Island was a revelation. The drill instructors stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuilt me from the ground up. I learned to shoot, to march, to follow orders without question. But more than that, I learned about the man I could become under pressure. My first letter home was stilted, formal. I wrote about the training, the other recruits, the sense of belonging I'd found among men who'd also chosen to serve. I didn't mention the homesickness, the moments of doubt, or the way my father's disapproval still echoed in my mind during the long nights in the barracks. He never wrote back. My mother sent care packages filled with cookies and news from home. Mrs. Patterson from down the street had asked about me. The mill was laying off more workers. Dad was putting in extra hours to make up for the lost income. She never directly said he was proud of me, but between the lines, I could sense a grudging respect beginning to form. The graduation ceremony was everything I'd hoped it would be. Standing at attention in my dress blues, I felt the weight of the eagle, globe, and anchor on my collar. I was no longer Michael Harrison, confused kid from Pittsburgh. I was Private First Class Harrison, United States Marine Corps. My parents came to the ceremony, my father looking uncomfortable in his one good suit. He stood stiffly during the parade, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was holding back words. But when I walked across that stage, when the commanding officer shook my hand and welcomed me to the brotherhood, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Respect. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at a small restaurant off base. The conversation was awkward, stilted, but my father asked questions about my training, about what came next. He listened when I talked about my assignment to Camp Lejeune, about the possibility of overseas deployment. "You look different," said finally, cutting into his steak, taller somehow. I was the same height I'd been when I left home, but I understood what he meant. The Marines had given me something I'd never had before: confidence in my own abilities, trust in my judgment, and the knowledge that I could handle whatever came my way. "I feel different," I admitted. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in my life I saw approval in his eyes. Not the grudging acceptance I'd grown up with, but genuine pride. "Maybe I was wrong," he said quietly. "Maybe this is exactly what you needed." As I packed my belongings for the move to North Carolina, I kept thinking about that moment. My father's words of support had come late, but they'd come. I promised myself that when I had children of my own, I'd be different. I'd support their choices, trust their judgment, and never let them doubt that I believed in them. It was a promise I'd spend the next 35 years trying to keep, and failing at in ways I never could have imagined. I met Sarah at a USO dance in Jacksonville during my first leave from Camp Lejeune. She was volunteering that night, serving punch and making small talk with homesick Marines, her smile genuine in a way that cut through the usual superficial interactions of military social events. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and when she handed me a cup of punch, her fingers brushed mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious in my dress uniform. "Only to someone who's been watching you stand in the corner for the past hour." She laughed, and the sound was like music after months of barked orders and military precision. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." "Michael Harrison." I extended my hand, and she shook it with a firm grip that surprised me. "And you're right. I'm not much of a dancer." "Well, lucky for you, I'm not much of a teacher. We can figure it out together." That night, we talked until the dance ended and the volunteers began cleaning up. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, had grown up in North Carolina, and had been volunteering with the USO since college. She spoke about her students with genuine affection, about the challenges of reaching kids who came from difficult backgrounds, about the small victories that made the long hours worthwhile. "What made you want to be a Marine?" she asked as we walked to her car. It was a question I'd been asked dozens of times, but somehow, with Sarah, the answer felt different, more honest. I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself, to serve something worth serving. She nodded thoughtfully. "My father was Navy, Korea. He used to say that some people are called to serve, and some people are called to support those who serve." I always thought I was the second type. When I asked her out for the following weekend, she said yes without hesitation. Our first official date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Wilmington. Nothing fancy, but she treated it like it was the most important evening of her life. She asked about my family, my dreams, my fears. In return, she shared stories about her students, her volunteer work, her quiet ambitions to maybe run her own school someday. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if we'd known each other for years instead of days. When I walked her to her door, she hesitated for a moment before rising on her toes to kiss me goodnight. It was soft, tentative, but it held a promise that made my heart race. Over the next few months, we saw each other whenever I could get leave. She'd drive down to Jacksonville, or I'd make the trip to Wilmington. We'd walk on the beach, talking about everything and nothing, her hand fitting perfectly in mine. She never complained about the military's demands on my time, never made me feel guilty for the uncertainty of my schedule. When my unit got orders for a 6-month deployment to the Mediterranean, I was dreading telling her. We'd been seeing each other for 4 months, and I was falling in love with her in a way that scared me. The night before I left, we sat on her porch swing, and I tried to find the words to explain what she meant to me. "I know this is hard," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But I'll be here when you get back. We'll write letters, and I'll send care packages, and we'll make it work." "You don't have to wait for me," I said, though every fiber of my being hoped she would. "I want to—" She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Open it when you get lonely, but not before." On the ship, 3 weeks into deployment, I finally opened her gift. Inside was a simple silver chain with a small cross pendant and a note, "To keep you safe until you come home to me. All my love, Sarah." I wore it every day, tucked beneath my uniform, a constant reminder of what I was fighting to get back to. My letters to her were longer than any I'd ever written, filled with descriptions of the places I'd seen, the people I'd met, the way the Mediterranean looked at sunset. Her letters in return were filled with news from home, stories about her students, and gentle reminders that someone was thinking about me every day. When I got back, she was waiting at the dock with a sign that read, "Welcome home, Michael," her smile brighter than the North Carolina sun. I dropped my sea bag and swept her into my arms, spinning her around until we were both dizzy and laughing. "I missed you," I whispered against her hair. "I missed you too," she said, pulling back to look at me. "But you're here now. That's what matters." 3 months later, I proposed. I'd saved every penny I could during deployment, and the ring was Modista simple solitaire that caught the light when she moved her hand. We were walking on the same beach where we'd spent so many evenings, and I stopped suddenly, pulling the ring box from my pocket. "Sarah Mitchell," I said, dropping to one knee on the sand, "will you marry me?" She said yes before I could finish the question, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes, Michael." "Yes, of course, yes." We were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at her family's church. My parents came down from Pittsburgh, my father looking proud in his rented tuxedo, my mother crying happy tears for the first time in years. Sarah's family welcomed me with open arms, treating me like the son they'd never had. During our first dance as husband and wife, Sarah looked up at me with those blue eyes that had captured my heart from the very beginning. "I love you, Michael." "Harrison," she said. "I love you too, Sarah Harrison," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. We honeymooned in the mountains of North Carolina, spending a week in a small cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of a nearby stream. It was perfect quiet, peaceful, and entirely ours. As we sat on the porch on our last night, Sarah curled up against my side, I felt a contentment I'd never experienced before. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "The future," I said. "Our future. Kids, maybe. A house with a white picket fence, growing old together." She smiled, tracing patterns on my chest with her finger. "I'd like that. All of it." Looking back now, I realize those were the happiest days of my life. Before the weight of command, before the deployments became longer and more dangerous, before the distance between duty and family became impossible to bridge. In that moment, anything seemed possible, and love felt like enough to conquer any obstacle we might face. I had no idea how much that love would be tested in the years to come. David was born on a Tuesday in March, screaming his disapproval at the world with the lung capacity of a future drill sergeant. I was stationed at camp. Pendleton then, and Sarah had moved to California to be with me. The base housing was small and sterile, but she'd transformed it into a home with flowered curtains and family photos. I held him for the first time in the hospital, this impossibly small person who was somehow half me and half Sarah, his tiny fingers wrapped around my index finger with surprising strength, and I felt something shift inside me, a fierce protectiveness I'd never experienced, even in combat. "He looks like you," Sarah whispered, exhausted but glowing. "He has your eyes," I replied, though at 3 days old. It was hard to tell much of anything except that he was perfect. Those first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes. I was a lance corporal then, eager to prove myself, but I found myself rushing home after every training exercise just to hold my son. Sarah handled most of the night feedings, but I insisted on taking the early morning shift so she could sleep. I'd sit in the rocking chair we'd bought at a garage sale, David sleeping against my chest, and whisper to him about the future. I told him about the places I'd seen, the things I wanted to show him, the kind of man I hoped he'd become. He'd make small noises in his sleep, and I'd pretend he was listening. When David turned 2, I bought him a baseball glove. It was far too big for his hands, but I had visions of playing catch in the backyard, teaching him to throw and bat and love the game the way I had as a kid. The glove was leather, real leather, and I'd saved for weeks to afford it. "He's too young, Michael," Sarah said, watching me try to work the glove onto David's tiny hand. "He'll grow into it," I insisted. "We'll practice every day," but every day proved elusive. Training exercises ran long. Weekend duty assignments came up unexpectedly. By the time I got home, David was often already asleep, or Sarah had him involved in some other activity. The glove sat on the shelf in his room, waiting for opportunities that never seemed to come. When he turned 5, we'd been transferred to Quantico. David was old enough for Little League, and I was determined to make up for lost time. I signed him up for the base team and showed up to his first practice with the old glove, now finally fitting his hand properly. "Dad, I don't really like baseball," he said, standing in the outfield during a practice drill. "You haven't given it a chance," I replied, positioning his hands on the bat. "Your stance is all wrong. Keep your eye on the ball." He tried. I'll give him credit for that. But it was clear his heart wasn't in it. He'd daydream in the outfield, more interested in the dandelions growing in the grass than the game happening around him. During one particularly memorable game, he sat down mid-inning to tie his shoes and missed a fly ball that would have been an easy out. "Michael, he's just not athletic," Sarah said after yet another practice where David had spent more time on the bench than in the field. "He could be if he applied himself," I insisted. "He's got good reflexes. He just needs to focus." But focus was exactly what David seemed to lack when it came to sports. He was bright, curious, and thoughtful, but he moved through the world at his own pace. He'd rather read a book than throw a ball, preferred building with his Legos to running around the yard. Where I saw lack of discipline, Sarah saw a child with different interests. The breaking point came during a father-son camping trip when David was 8. I'd planned a whole weekend of outdoor activities, hiking, fishing, campfire stories. I wanted to share with him the love of nature that had sustained me through difficult deployments. To teach him self-reliance and outdoor skills, David lasted. Exactly 4 hours before he was homesick and asking to go home. The mosquitoes bothered him. The sleeping bag was uncomfortable. He was afraid of the sounds in the dark. Instead of the bonding experience I'd envisioned, the trip became an exercise in frustrated parenting. "I want Mom," he said, tears streaming down his face as we sat by the dying campfire. "Men don't cry, David," I said, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. "But I'm scared," he whispered. I looked at my 8-year-old son. This sensitive boy who felt things so deeply and realized I had no idea how to connect with him. Everything that had worked for me as a child, structure, discipline, pushing through discomfort, seemed to make him withdraw further. We drove home the next morning. The silence in the car heavy with mutual disappointment. Sarah took one look at David's tear-stained face and my frustrated expression and knew the trip hadn't gone as planned. "Maybe next time we could try something different," she suggested gently. "The Science Museum has a new exhibit on space exploration. David's been talking about it for weeks." I nodded, but inside I felt like a failure. How could I lead Marines in combat but not connect with my own son? Other fathers seemed to navigate this effortlessly, but every attempt I made seemed to push David further away. The baseball glove went back on the shelf, this time permanently. David never asked about it, and I never brought it up. It became a symbol of my good intentions and complete misunderstanding of who my son actually was. Years later, when David was in middle school, I found him in his room reading a book about the Civil War. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I saw an opportunity to connect over something I knew well. "That's a good book," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed. The Battle of Gettysburg was particularly brutal. His eyes lit up, and for the next hour we discussed strategy and tactics, leadership and sacrifice. It was the longest conversation we'd had in months, and I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe we could find common ground after all, but those moments were rare. More often, our interactions were limited to homework checks and household rules. I'd ask about his day, he'd give one-word answers. I'd try to share something from my own experience, and he'd politely listen before excusing himself to his room. Sarah bridged the gap between us, translating my intentions to David and his needs to me. She'd tell me about his school projects, his friends, his quiet achievements. Through her, I learned that he was an excellent student, that his teachers praised his thoughtfulness and maturity, that he had a small group of close friends who shared his interests, but I learned these things secondhand, like intelligence reports from a foreign country. My son was growing up right in front of me, and somehow I was missing all of it. The baseball glove still sits in his old room, now my study. Sometimes I'll see it on the shelf and remember that hopeful father who thought he could shape his son in his own image. I understand now that David was never meant to be a copy of me, he was meant to be himself. But it took me far too long to realize that being different didn't mean being wrong. Afghanistan in 2003 was a moonscape of dust and danger, where the line between ally and enemy shifted like the desert sand. I was a major then, commanding a company of Marines tasked with securing supply routes in Helmand Province. The helmet I wore bore the scars of previous deployments, a bullet graze along the left side that I'd earned in Iraq, a reminder that luck was as important as skill in staying alive. The heat was oppressive, reaching 120 degrees by midday, and the gear we carried made it feel like we were walking through hell in full battle dress. But it was the uncertainty that wore on us most. Every patrol could be routine or could end in an ambush. Every friendly wave from a local could be genuine or could be a signal to waiting insurgents. My Marines were good men, most of them younger than David is now. Corporal Johnson from Texas, who kept a photo of his newborn daughter tucked inside his helmet. Sergeant Martinez from California, who could make the rest of us laugh even in the darkest moments. Lance Corporal Thompson from North Carolina, barely 19, who reminded me so much of myself at that age it was sometimes painful to look at him. The bond between us was forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. In combat, rank mattered less than trust. These men would follow me into hell because they knew I'd lead them back out again. They called me old man, despite the fact that I was only 38. And they meant it with affection. We'd been in country for 3 months. When the intelligence reports started coming in about increased Taliban activity in our sector, convoys were being hit with improvised explosive devices. Patrols were encountering more sophisticated ambush. The local population, previously neutral or even friendly, was growing distant and suspicious. "Something's building," Sergeant Martinez said one evening as we reviewed patrol reports. "They're probing our defenses, testing our response times." I'd learned to trust my NCO's instincts. They spent more time with the enlisted men, heard the chatter that didn't make it into official reports. If Martinez was worried, I was worried. The communications from home during this period were a lifeline to sanity. Sarah wrote every day, letters filled with news about David's school activities and Emma's first steps. David was 10 then, old enough to write his own letters, though they were brief and careful. "Dear Dad," one letter began, "I hope you're safe. Mom says you're helping people in Afghanistan. I got an A on my science project about the solar system. I miss you. Love, David." I kept every letter, reading them over and over during the long watches. David's handwriting was neat and precise, much like his personality. He told me about his books, his friends, his classes, but never about his feelings. Even at 10, he was guarded, careful not to reveal too much. In my letters home, I tried to strike a balance between honesty and reassurance. I told them about the Afghan children who would wave at our patrols, about the beauty of the mountains at sunset, about the pride I felt in my Marines' professionalism. I didn't mention the roadside bombs, the mortar attacks on our base, or the way the stress was affecting all of us. "Be careful, Michael," Sarah wrote in one letter. "David asked me if you were going to come home safe." I told him of course you would, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He's old enough now to understand that war is dangerous. The weight of their worry was sometimes harder to bear than the physical dangers we faced. Every mission carried the possibility that I might not make it home to see David grow up, to walk Emma down the aisle someday, to grow old with Sarah. The responsibility to my Marines was matched by the responsibility to my family. One night, during a particularly intense firefight, I took cover behind a concrete barrier while bullets whined overhead. My helmet took a direct hit from a ricochet, the impact strong enough to snap my head back and leave my ears ringing. When I reached up to check for damage, my fingers came away bloody. "Sir, you're hit!" Corporal Johnson shouted over the gunfire. The bullet had grazed the helmet but hadn't penetrated. A few inches lower, and Sarah would have been getting a visit from the casualty notification officers. The thought sobered me more than the near miss itself. After the firefight, I sat in my hoche examining the damaged helmet. The bullet had left a deep gouge in the Kevlar, a permanent reminder of how thin the line was between coming home and not coming home. I thought about David, about how he'd react to news of my death. Would he remember me as the father who tried to teach him baseball, or as the soldier who died in a war he didn't understand? The camaraderie among my Marines was both a comfort and a burden. We shared everything: rations, water, stories from home, fears about the future. But as their commanding officer, I also carried the weight of their safety. Every decision I made could mean the difference between life and death for men who trusted me implicitly. During quiet moments, when the fighting died down and we had time to think, I'd find myself wondering if I was doing the right thing. Not just tactically, but morally. Was being here, fighting this war, worth the price my family was paying? Was the sacrifice of time with David and Emma justified by the mission we were accomplishing? The Afghan people we encountered were a mix of allies, enemies, and civilians, caught in between. Some genuinely appreciated our presence, seeing us as protectors against Taliban extremism. Others viewed us as occupiers, no different from the Soviets who had invaded their country a generation earlier. Most were simply trying to survive, to keep their families safe in a country that had known nothing but war for decades. My Marines adapted to the complexity with remarkable maturity. They handed out candy to children during the day and fought insurgents at night. They learned basic phrases in Dari and Pashto, tried to understand the culture they were operating in, and maintained their humanity despite the dehumanizing nature of war. "You think we're making a difference here, sir?" Lance Corporal Thompson asked one evening as we watched the sunset over the mountains. It was a question I'd been asking myself daily. "I think we're doing our job," I replied. "Whether that makes a difference in the long run, I don't know. But we're protecting each other, and that's what matters most." He nodded, accepting the answer even though it wasn't particularly satisfying. At 19, he was old enough to fight, but young enough to still believe that wars could be won cleanly, that good guys and bad guys were easily distinguishable. That sacrifice always led to meaningful victory. I envied him that optimism, even as I knew it wouldn't survive much longer. Afghanistan had a way of complicating simple truths, of turning clear missions into murky moral dilemmas. But that was still ahead of us. For now, we were Marines doing our duty, brothers in arms facing an uncertain future together. The helmet, with its bullet graze, sits in my closet now, a reminder of how close I came to never making it home. David has never seen it, never asked about my close calls or the dangers I faced. Sometimes I wonder if he'd understand better if he knew how. Many times I almost didn't come back to him. The letter I wrote to Sarah that night was different from all the others. Instead of the usual updates about patrol schedules and weather conditions, I found myself writing about love, about regrets, about the man I hoped David would become if something happened to me. "My dearest Sarah," I began, the words flowing more easily than usual. "If you're reading this, then something has gone wrong, and I won't be coming home. There are things I should have said more often, things I should have done differently." I paused, staring at the paper in the dim light of my hoach. Outside, the sounds of the base continued, generators humming, guards calling out positions, the distant rumble of vehicles. But inside, there was only the scratch of my pen and the weight of words I'd never been able to say out loud. "I love you more than I ever found the words to express. You've been my anchor through every deployment, every difficult moment, every doubt about whether I was doing the right thing. You made me a better man, and I hope I made you happy." The intelligence briefing that morning had been ominous. 3 separate sources confirmed that a major Taliban offensive was being planned in our sector. The details were sketchy, but the pattern was clear: increased weapons smuggling, foreign fighters moving into the area, and a sudden drop in local cooperation with coalition forces. "They're planning something big," Colonel Mitchell had said, spreading the maps across the table. "All indicators point to a coordinated attack within the next 72 hours. My company's position was strategically vital. We controlled the main supply route through the mountains and provided security for the forward operating base that housed nearly 300 coalition troops. If the Taliban wanted to make a statement, we'd be a logical target." "What's our reinforcement timeline?" I asked. 48 hours minimum, the colonel replied. Maybe longer if weather doesn't cooperate. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 48 hours was an eternity in combat. We'd be on our own, with whatever resources we had on hand, facing an enemy that knew the terrain better than we did. That evening, I gathered my squad leaders for a planning session. The faces around the table were grim but determined. These were seasoned Marines who'd been through combat before. Men who understood that leadership meant making hard decisions under impossible circumstances. Intel suggests we're looking at a coordinated assault, I told them. Multiple axes of attack, probably at dawn. They'll try to overwhelm our perimeter and take the base. Sergeant Martinez leaned forward, studying the tactical maps. What about the civilian population in the village? It was a good question, one that highlighted the moral complexity of our situation. The village of Khanabad sat in the valley below our position, home to about 200 Afghan families. Intelligence suggested that some villagers were cooperating with the Taliban, but others were genuinely neutral or even supportive of coalition forces. We'll do everything we can to protect them, I said. But our primary mission is to hold this position and protect the base. The planning session lasted until nearly midnight. We reviewed fields of fire, ammunition supplies, medical evacuation procedures, and contingency plans. Every scenario we discussed ended with the same conclusion. We'd be heavily outnumbered and fighting from a defensive position that offered limited advantages. Sir, Lance Corporal Thompson said as the meeting broke up, do you really think we can hold? I looked at this young Marine, barely old enough to vote, asking me to predict the outcome of a battle that hadn't yet begun. The honest answer was that I didn't know. The Taliban had been planning this attack for weeks, possibly months. They'd chosen the time and place, had superior numbers, and knew every rock and gully in the surrounding terrain. We'll hold, I told him. That's what Marines do. After the others left, I sat alone in my hutch. Staring at the half-finished letter to Sarah, the words I'd written seemed inadequate. Too formal for what might be my final communication with the woman I loved. I picked up my pen and continued writing. Tell David that I'm proud of him, even if I didn't always show it well. I know I wasn't the father he needed sometimes, too focused on making him into something he wasn't meant to be. He's a good boy, thoughtful and kind, and he'll grow into a fine man. I hope he'll forgive me for missing so much of his childhood. The weight of those words settled over me like a physical burden. All the missed baseball games, the impatient moments when he'd struggled with something that came easily to me, the times I'd chosen duty over family, they all seemed magnified in the face of potential loss. Take care of Emma for me. Help her. Remember that her daddy loved her more than life itself. And David, help him understand that everything I did was because I believed it was right, not because I loved him any less. I sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote Sarah's name on the front, and placed it in the small metal box where I kept important documents. If something happened to me, the personal effects team would find it, and make sure it reached her. The next morning brought news that confirmed our worst fears. Surveillance drones had spotted large groups of fighters moving through the mountains, and radio intercepts suggested the attack would come at dawn the following day. We had less than 24 hours to prepare. I spent the day checking positions, reviewing plans, and talking to my Marines. Each conversation felt weighted with significance, as if it might be our last. I tried to project confidence, to maintain the calm leadership they needed, but inside I felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that preceded every major engagement. That evening, as I made final preparations, I thought about the letter to Sarah, about the words I'd written about David. I wondered if he'd ever read them. If they'd help him understand the choices I'd made and the love that motivated them. The final intelligence update came at 2,100 hours. Enemy forces were estimated at battalion strength, roughly 400 fighters armed with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortar. They'd be supported by foreign fighters with military experience, men who understood tactics and weren't just enthusiastic volunteers. Gentlemen, I told my squad leaders during our final briefing, tomorrow we're going to face the fight of our lives. But we've trained for this. We know our jobs, we trust each other, and we have the finest Marines in the world standing beside us." The words sounded confident, but my hands were shaking slightly as I folded the map. I'd led men in combat before, but never facing odds this steep. Every decision I made in the coming hours could mean life or death for the Marines under my command, as the sun set behind the mountains. Painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I took one last look at the letter to Sarah. The envelope seemed small and insignificant compared to the magnitude of what we were facing, but it contained everything that mattered to me outside of this moment. I thought about David, probably doing homework at the kitchen table while Sarah made dinner. He'd be focused and serious, the way he approached everything in life. In a few hours, when the sun rose on the other side of the world, he'd start another normal day of school and friends and childhood concerns. If things went badly here, that normal day might be the last one he'd have before learning that his father wasn't coming home. The weight of that possibility was almost unbearable, but it was also clarifying. Whatever happened tomorrow, I'd fight. Not just for my Marines or the mission, but for the chance to see my son grow up, to bridge the distance between us, to become the father he deserved. The letter to Sarah, with its words of love and regret, sat waiting in the metal box. Tomorrow would determine whether it remained a precaution or became a final goodbye. The attack came at 0547 hours, just as the first light of dawn painted the mountains in pale gold. I was in the command post reviewing final defensive positions when the first mortar round screamed overhead, their whistling cry followed by the thunderous crack of explosions. "Contact! Contact! Multiple positions!" Sergeant Martinez's voice crackled over the radio from Observation Post 2. "At least 50 fighters moving up the eastern approach." I grabbed my rifle and helmet, the same helmet that had taken a bullet grazed months earlier. As I ran toward the defensive perimeter, more reports flooded the radio net. The attack was coming from 3 directions simultaneously, exactly as intelligence had predicted. "Sir!" Corporal Johnson appeared at my side, breathing hard. "Western. Approach is under heavy fire. Lieutenant Reeves is requesting immediate reinforcement of positions 7 and 8. The sound of gunfire was constant now, the sharp crack of our M4S, mixed with the deeper bark of AK-47s and the whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades. Dust and smoke filled the air as mortar rounds continued to fall randomly across our position. I reached the command bunker and immediately began coordinating our response. The Taliban had planned well, timing their assault to come just after sunrise when the light would be in our eyes as we looked east. They were using the terrain skillfully, advancing under cover of the boulder fields that surrounded our position. "Delta Squad, shift fire to grid 417928, I called into the radio. "Charlie Squad, I need you to reinforce the western perimeter now." The battle developed rapidly, with enemy fighters advancing closer to our defensive positions with each passing minute. They were disciplined, well-armed, and clearly had experienced leadership. This wasn't the usual harassing attack we'd grown accustomed to. This was a coordinated assault designed to overrun our position. 20 minutes into the fight, the situation became critical. Lieutenant Reeves reported that the western perimeter was about to be breached, and Sergeant Martinez called for urgent medical evacuation from Op 2. "Sir, we've got casualties." Hospital Corpsman Fletcher's voice was strained over the radio. 3 urgent, 2 routine. I need immediate extraction to the aid station. I looked at the tactical display, my mind racing through options. The landing zone for medical helicopters was exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. Any attempt to evacuate casualties would require us to suppress enemy positions that were well concealed and expertly positioned. That's when I saw them. 14 Marines cut off from the main defensive perimeter, trapped in a communications bunker that had taken a direct hit from a mortar round. The bunker's walls were partially collapsed, and enemy fighters were advancing on their position from 2 sides. "Ghost 6, this is Ghost 2-1, came the desperate call from Staff Sergeant Williams. "We're surrounded and running low on ammunition. Request immediate assistance." I could see the situation clearly from my position. The 14 Marines were pinned down with no route of escape. Enemy fighters were positioning themselves to assault the bunker. And once they did, those Marines would be captured or killed, but extracting them would require exposing myself and several other Marines to intense enemy fire. The safest course of action would be to call in artillery or air support, but that would take time we didn't have. By the time the shells arrived, those 14 men would be dead. The choice crystallized in my mind with brutal clarity. I could maintain my position in relative safety and coordinate the overall defense, or I could lead a rescue mission that would save those Marines but put myself and others at extreme risk. I thought of the letter to Sarah sitting in my hoche, of David doing homework at our kitchen table, of Emma taking her first steps. Everything I loved in the world was tied to my survival. But looking at those trapped Marines boys barely older than my son, I knew there was no choice at all. Martinez, take 2 squads and establish a base of fire on the eastern slope, I ordered. Johnson, you're with me. We're going to extract those Marines. Sir, that's suicide, Johnson protested. There's no covered approach to that position. He was right. The route to the trapped Marines required crossing 50 meters of open ground under direct enemy fire. Military doctrine would call for suppressive fire and a coordinated assault, but we didn't have the luxury of time or overwhelming firepower. Follow me, I said, checking my weapon and adjusting my gear. What happened next occurred in slow motion and lightning speed simultaneously. I led 5 Marines across that open ground, enemy bullets snapping past our heads like angry wasps. Corporal Thompson took a round through the shoulder but kept moving. Lance Corporal Davis stumbled when shrapnel from a grenade tore through his leg, but he crawled the rest of the way. We reached the bunker as enemy fighters were preparing their final assault. For the next 40 minutes, we held them off while organizing the evacuation of the trapped Marines. One by one, we moved the wounded to covered positions, then provided covering fire as the rest of the squad moved to safety. I was the last one out. Maintaining suppressive fire as my Marines withdrew, that's when the mortar round landed 10 feet. From my position, the blast wave picking me up and slamming me against the concrete wall of the bunker. When I regained consciousness, Hospital Corpsman Fletcher was working on my wounds. Blood was running down my face from a head injury and my left arm hung useless at my side. But all 14 Marines were alive and the enemy assault had been repelled. Sir, you saved them, Thompson said, his own shoulder wrapped in bandages. All of them. As I lay in the aid station waiting for medical evacuation, I reached for my dog tags with my good hand. They were bent and bloody, the metal twisted from the explosion that had nearly killed me. The chain had broken, and one of the tags was missing, probably blown away by the blast that had left me deaf in one ear and shaking from concussion. In that moment, as the adrenaline faded and the pain set in, I thought about choice. I'd chosen to risk everything to save those Marines, and somehow we'd all survived. But the weight of that choice, the knowledge that I'd nearly left Sarah a widow and David fatherless, was almost overwhelming. The damaged dog tags would later be replaced, but I kept the twisted remnants as a reminder. Not of heroism, but of the fine line between duty and recklessness, between saving lives and destroying families. 14 Marines went home to their families because of the choice I made that day. But I'd also chosen to risk never seeing my own family again, and that knowledge would haunt me for years to come. The Medal of Honor citation would speak of valor and selfless service. It wouldn't mention the nightmares, the guilt, or the way that choice had changed me forever. Heroes, I learned, aren't born from fearless acts. They're forged in moments when fear and duty collide, and duty wins by the smallest of margins. The Purple Heart came with the territory, a small medal for wounds received in combat, routine enough that most Marines barely acknowledged it. But mine felt different, heavier somehow, because it represented not just physical wounds but something deeper that had been damaged in that bunker. The physical injuries healed relatively quickly. The concussion left me with persistent headaches and partial hearing loss in my left ear. The shrapnel wounds on my back required surgery and left scars that still ache when the weather changes. My left shoulder never quite regained full range of motion, a reminder that bodies, like spirits, don't always return to their original form after trauma, but it was the invisible wounds that proved most difficult to treat. Sleep became elusive, punctuated by dreams where I was running across that open ground again and again, But this time I wasn't fast enough. This time the 14 Marines died because I hesitated, because I chose safety over duty, because I failed them when they needed me most. During the day I threw myself into recovery with the same intensity I'd brought to every other challenge in my life. Physical therapy, psychological evaluations, endless debriefings about the incident. The Marine Corps wanted to understand exactly what had happened, to learn lessons that might save lives in future engagements. Can you walk us through the decision-making process again, Major? The intelligence officer asked during one of countless interviews. What factors led you to attempt the rescue rather than call for artillery support? How do you explain instinct to someone who lives in a world of protocols and procedures? How do you describe the moment when training and doctrine give way to something more fundamental, the refusal to let good men die on your watch? There wasn't time to wait for artillery, I said for the dozenth time. Those Marines needed immediate assistance. But the risk to yourself and your rescue team was considerable. Did you consider the impact to overall mission effectiveness, if you'd been killed or incapacitated? I had considered it in the split second between seeing those trapped Marines and deciding to act. But the calculation wasn't about mission effectiveness or acceptable losses. It was about the kind of leader I wanted to be, the kind of man I could live with being. I considered it, I replied. I decided the risk was acceptable. What I didn't tell the intelligence officer was about the dreams, about waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced I could hear enemy gunfire in the distance. About the way sudden loud noises made me jump, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. About the guilt that ate at me during quiet moments, not guilt over the rescue, but guilt over the men who hadn't made it home from other missions. Other choices. The medical staff at Walter Reed was thorough and professional. They had protocols for treating post-traumatic stress, techniques that had been refined through years of treating combat veterans. Group therapy sessions where Marines shared their experiences with others who understood the weight of command. Decisions. Individual counseling that helped me process the complex emotions surrounding the incident. You're experiencing survivor's guilt, Dr. Patterson explained during one of our sessions. It's common among service members who've been through traumatic events, especially those in leadership positions. But I'm not the one who died, I said. Everyone made it home. Exactly. And part of you feels guilty about that, guilty that you survived when others in different situations didn't. Guilty that you're being called a hero for doing something. That felt like basic duty. She was right, though I couldn't have articulated it myself. The label of hero felt wrong, almost insulting to the men who'd made ultimate sacrifices in other battles. I'd done my job under difficult circumstances, but that hardly seemed worthy of the attention and accolades that followed. The worst part was the isolation. My fellow Marines treated me differently now, not with disrespect, but with a kind of reverence that created distance. Conversations would stop when I entered a room, not from embarrassment, but from a sense that I'd somehow transcended the normal bonds of military brotherhood. How does it feel to be a hero, sir? A young lance corporal asked during a visit to the base. I'm not a hero, I replied. I'm just a Marine who did his job. The label stuck, amplified by media coverage and official recognition. The incident had occurred during a particularly difficult period in the war, and the military was eager to highlight positive stories. My rescue of 14 Marines became a symbol of American courage and determination, a narrative that fit neatly into the political requirements of the moment. The hardest part was writing to the families of the Marines I'd rescued. Each letter was an exercise in finding the right words to explain something that defied explanation. How do you tell a mother that her son came home because another man was willing to risk leaving his own children fatherless? Dear Mrs. Thompson, I wrote to the mother of the young lance corporal who'd taken a bullet during the rescue. Your son showed remarkable courage under fire. He was wounded while helping extract fellow Marines from a dangerous position, and his actions undoubtedly saved lives. You should be proud of the man he's become. I didn't mention that he'd been wounded because I'd led him into a situation that military doctrine would have deemed unnecessarily risky. I didn't tell her about the nightmares or the way her son's courage had both inspired and humbled me. Some truths were too complex for letters home. The Purple Heart sits in my study now, in a small frame beside other decorations. Visitors often notice it, though they rarely ask about the circumstances. Combat wounds are simultaneously fascinating and uncomfortable for civilians, evidence of sacrifice they admire, but experiences they can't quite comprehend. David has never asked about it, though I've caught him looking at it occasionally. I wonder if he understands what it represents, if he realizes that every medal in that case came with a price that extended beyond the moment of earning it. Sometimes I wish I could explain to him that heroism isn't about fearlessness or supernatural courage. It's about being afraid and acting anyway, about accepting the weight of consequences that extend far beyond yourself. It's about living with choices that seemed clear in the moment but become complicated in the years that follow. The physical wounds from Afghanistan healed, mostly, but the invisible ones, the responsibility, the guilt, the knowledge of how close I came to never coming home, those proved more persistent. They changed the way I slept, the way I reacted to stress, the way I related to my family. In trying to save those 14 Marines, I'd saved something in myself as well. But I'd also lost something, a kind of innocence about the cost of duty, an understanding that every choice in combat ripples outward in ways you can't predict or control. The Purple Heart represents both the wound and the healing, both the price paid and the price avoided. It's a reminder that coming home from war isn't just about surviving. It's about learning to live with the weight of survival when others didn't have that luxury. The White House ceremony was everything I'd never imagined and everything I'd never wanted. Standing in the East Room, surrounded by family members and fellow service members, I felt like an imposter wearing someone else's uniform. The Medal of Honor citation lay in a leather folder on the president's podium, its formal language describing actions that felt disconnected from my memory of that chaotic morning in Afghanistan. The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to Major Michael James Harrison, United States Marine Corps, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The military aide read in a clear, formal voice that echoed through the ornate room. Sarah sat in the front row, beautiful in her navy blue dress, tears streaming down her face. David, 13 now and uncomfortable in his dress clothes, kept shifting in his seat. Emma, only 8, was wide-eyed at the grandeur of the White House, though I could tell she didn't fully understand what was happening. As the citation continued, describing the rescue in clinical military terms, I found myself remembering the actual event differently. The citation spoke of deliberate advance under intense enemy fire and tactical brilliance under pressure. My memory was of fear, desperation, and split-second decisions made with incomplete information. Major Harrison's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflected great credit upon himself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. The aide concluded. The President stepped forward, holding the light blue ribbon and distinctive star that would forever mark me as a Medal of Honor recipient. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, but I could barely focus on his words of congratulation. All I could think about was the weight of expectation that would come with this recognition. Your actions saved 14 lives, the President said quietly, for my ears alone. Their families owe you a debt that can never be repaid. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Those 14 Marines were in the audience, along with their families. I had met with them before the ceremony, and their gratitude was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Williams had brought his newborn daughter, born 6 months after we returned from Afghanistan. She exists because of you, sir, he'd said simply, but standing there as the medal was placed around my neck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being honored for doing something that any decent leader would have done. The alternative, leaving those Marines to die, had never been an option. How do you accept recognition for refusing to abandon your men? The reception afterward was a blur of handshakes and photographs. Members of Congress, military leaders, and families of the rescued Marines all wanted to share a moment with the newest Medal of Honor recipient. I smiled and nodded and said all the appropriate things, but inside I felt increasingly disconnected from the celebration. Dad, can I see the medal? David asked during a quiet moment. He'd been unusually subdued throughout the ceremony, intimidated, perhaps by the formal atmosphere of the White House. I lifted the ribbon so he could examine the star-shaped medal more closely. His fingers traced the design an eagle perched atop an anchor, surrounded by a wreath of laurel leaves. "It's heavy," he said. "Yes, it is," I replied, "and not just physically." The Medal of Honor came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the moment of earning it. Recipients were expected to be ambassadors for the military, to speak at ceremonies and events, to embody the values of service and sacrifice. "Does it hurt?" Emma asked, pointing to the ribbon around my neck. "No, sweetheart," I said, lifting her up so she could see the medal better. "It doesn't hurt." That was a lie, though not one I could explain to an 8-year-old. The medal did hurt in ways that had nothing to do with its physical weight. It hurt because it marked me as different, set me apart from the Marines I'd served with. It hurt because it reduced a complex military action to a simple narrative of heroism. Most of all, it hurt because I knew that accepting it meant accepting a version of myself that I wasn't sure I recognized. The flight home was quiet. Sarah held my hand while the children slept, and we didn't talk much about the ceremony. I could tell she was proud of the recognition, proud of what I'd accomplished, proud to be married to a Medal of Honor recipient. But she also sensed my ambivalence about the whole experience. "You okay?" she asked as we descended toward Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point. "Just tired," I said, which was true but incomplete. I was tired, but I was also struggling with the disconnect between the hero described in the citation and the man I knew myself to be. The local news crews were waiting when we arrived home. Word of the ceremony had spread quickly, and suddenly, our quiet neighborhood was buzzing with reporters and photographers. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to came by to offer congratulations, and the phone rang constantly with interview requests. "Major Harrison, how does it feel to be a hero?" a reporter asked as we walked from the car to our front door. "I was just doing my job," I replied, the phrase that would become my standard response to such questions, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Doing my job would have meant calling for artillery support and waiting for reinforcements. What I'd done was make a choice that went beyond standard operating procedures, a choice based on instinct and values rather than military doctrine. That night, after the children were asleep and the phone had finally stopped ringing, I sat in my study with the Medal of Honor certificate. The formal language described actions I'd taken, but it couldn't capture the complexity of the decision or the weight of its consequences. "The citation makes it sound so clear-cut," I said to Sarah as she brought me a cup of coffee. "Isn't it?" she asked. "You saved 14 men? That seems pretty clear to me." I wanted to explain the doubt, the second-guessing, the knowledge that luck had played as large a role as skill in our survival. I wanted to tell her about the dreams, about the way I sometimes wondered if I'd been brave or simply unable to live with the alternative, but looking at her face, seeing the pride and love there, I couldn't find the words. She needed the hero. From the citation, the man who'd made an impossible choice and saved lives through courage and determination. The reality that I'd been scared, uncertain, and operating on instinct was too complicated for the moment. "You're right," I said. Instead, 14 men came home to their families. The medal would open doors and create opportunities, but it would also create expectations and responsibilities that I was only beginning to understand. People would look at me differently now, as if the medal had transformed me into something more than human. David never asked about the specifics of what I'd done to earn the recognition. He seemed proud in his quiet way, but also puzzled by the attention. For him, I was still just dad, flawed, human, struggling to balance duty and family. Maybe that was the most honest perspective of all. The Medal of Honor had been earned in a moment of crisis, but it would have to be lived with for a lifetime. The real test wouldn't be whether I'd been brave enough to save those Marines, but whether I'd be wise enough to carry the weight of that recognition without losing sight of who I really was. The drawing was tucked away in David's old school folder, forgotten among homework assignments and permission slips. I found it while helping Sarah clean out the storage closet, a child's crayon rendering of a man in military uniform with "My Hero Dad" written in careful second-grade lettering across the top, It was dated 3 years after my return from Afghanistan, when David was still young enough to see the world in simple terms of good and bad, heroes and villains. In the drawing, I stood impossibly tall, wearing a uniform that was more red, white, and blue than marine green. A crooked American flag waved in the background, and stick figures representing his family smiled beneath a yellow crayon sun. "Look at this," I called to Sarah, holding up the drawing. She came over and smiled, her expression soft with memory. "He was so proud of you then. He took that to school for show and tell, told everyone his dad was a real hero." I stared at the drawing, trying to remember when David's perception of me had changed. When had I stopped being the hero dad and become just another adult who didn't understand him? The transformation had been so gradual that I'd barely noticed it happening. Those first months, after returning from Afghanistan, were a mixture of adjustment and celebration. The Medal of Honor had brought attention that I wasn't comfortable with, but it had also brought my family together in a way that we hadn't experienced in years. David would introduce me to his friends with obvious pride, and Emma would tell anyone who'd listened that her daddy was a hero. I tried to use the opportunity to reconnect with David, to bridge the gap that had formed during my deployments. We'd spend Saturday mornings together, him asking questions about the military while I attempted to explain complex concepts in terms a 10-year-old could understand. "Dad, were you scared when you saved those men?" he asked one morning as we worked on a model airplane together. It was exactly the kind of question that adults at ceremonies and interviews always asked, but coming from David, it felt different. More honest somehow. "Yes," I told him, "I was very scared, but you did it anyway. Sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared." He nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that characterized everything he did. David had always been a thoughtful child, more comfortable with books than with people, more interested in understanding how things worked than in playing games. For a brief period, maybe 6 months, it felt like we were building something real, together. He'd wait for me to come home from work, eager to share something he'd learned at school or to show me a project he was working on. We'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner, and I'd help with homework while Sarah cleaned up, but the demands of recognition slowly began to intrude on family time. Speaking engagements, ceremonial duties, interviews. The military wanted to showcase their newest Medal of Honor recipient, and I felt obligated to comply. The hero narrative required maintenance, and that meant being away from home more often than I'd anticipated. "I have to go to Washington again next week," I told Sarah one evening. "Congressional hearing on military readiness?" "That's the 3rd trip this month," she replied, not accusingly, but with the weariness of a military spouse who'd spent years adapting to duty requirements. "I know, I'm sorry. But this is important. They want Medal of Honor recipients to testify about training standards." She nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Not disappointment in me exactly, but in the situation we found ourselves in. Just when it seemed like I might be able to focus on family, duty called again in a different form. David stopped waiting for me to come home. The homework sessions became less frequent, replaced by Sarah helping him while I attended functions or prepared remarks for speeches. The questions about military service gradually gave way to polite but distant conversations about school and friends. I told myself it was normal, that all children grew more independent as they got older. But looking back, I can see that I was losing him again, just as I'd lost him during the deployments. The difference was that this time I was physically present but emotionally unavailable, distracted by the demands of being a public figure. The breaking point came during David's 11th birthday party. I'd promised to be there, had even turned down a speaking engagement to make sure I'd be home. But an hour before the party, I received a call about an emergency meeting with congressional staff regarding veteran benefits legislation. "Michael, you promised," Sarah said when I explained the situation. "I know, but this is about helping other veterans. I can't say no to that." "You can't say no to anything anymore? When was the last time you said no to a military obligation and yes to a family one?" I couldn't answer because I couldn't remember. Every request seemed important. Every opportunity to represent the Marine Corps or veterans' causes felt like a duty I couldn't abandon. The same sense of responsibility that had driven me to rescue those Marines was now driving me away from my own family. I went to the meeting, and Sarah handled the birthday party alone. When I got home, the decorations were still up and left over. Cake sat on the kitchen counter. David was in his room playing quietly with his new toys. "How was the party?" I asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. "It was fine," he said, not looking up from his Lego construction. "I'm sorry I missed it. The meeting was very important." "I know, Dad," Mom explained. But there was something different in his voice, a distance that hadn't been there before. He wasn't angry. David rarely expressed anger directly. Instead, he'd begun to retreat, to protect himself from disappointment by not expecting much from me in the first place. The drawing captured a moment before that retreat began, when David still believed that having a hero for a father meant something special. Before he learned that heroes, like everyone else, make choices about where to invest their time and attention, I kept the drawing, tucking it away in my desk drawer where I'd see it occasionally while working on speeches or correspondence. It became a reminder of what I'd lost in gaining recognition, not just time with David, but his uncomplicated admiration and trust. Years later, when David's resentment became more obvious and our relationship grew increasingly strained, I'd think about that drawing. I'd remember the pride in his voice when he called me his hero, Dad, and I'd wonder if there was a way to earn that title back. But by then, David was old enough to understand that heroes were complicated people who made difficult choices. He'd learned that having a Medal of Honor didn't make someone a perfect father, and that public recognition sometimes came at the cost of private relationships. The drawing stays hidden in my desk, a reminder of simpler times when love and admiration were uncomplicated, when being a hero to my country felt less important than being a hero to my son. The Father's Day card was never given to me, though I only discovered its existence years later when Sarah was organizing David's old school papers. It was handmade, constructed from construction paper, and decorated with markers. The kind of earnest craft project that elementary schools assign to help children express feelings they might not have words for. On the front, in David's careful 9-year-old handwriting, were the words, "To the best dad in the world." Inside, he'd written a poem that made my chest tight with regret. "My dad is brave and strong and true. He fights for me and others too. Sometimes he's gone, but that's okay, because I know he'll come back someday. I wish that we could play more games and that he'd stay home sometimes. But I'm proud he helps other people even when it makes me sad." At the bottom, in smaller letters, as if he'd been uncertain about including it, he'd written, "I love you. Dad, I hope you love me too." Sarah found it in a folder with other school projects, mixed in with book reports and math worksheets. "He never gave it to you," she said quietly, sitting on the edge of our bed with the card in her hands. "Why not?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Father's Day was during your second Afghanistan deployment. He made it at school, brought it home all excited, and then realized you weren't here to give it to." I found him crying over it that night. I took the card from her, reading the poem again. The words revealed so much about David's inner world. At 9, his pride in my service, his understanding of duty, but also his longing for a father who was present more than absent. The final line broke my heart. A 9-year-old boy unsure whether his father loved him. That deployment had been particularly difficult for the family. I'd been gone for 8 months, missing not just Father's Day but David's birthday, his school play, and the science fair where he'd won first place for a project on solar systems. Each missed milestone was a small wound in our relationship, accumulating into a larger distance that I didn't know how to bridge. "I tried to explain that you'd want to see it when you got home," Sarah continued, "but he said it wouldn't be the same. That Father's Day cards were supposed to be given on Father's Day." He was right, of course. Delayed gestures of love, no matter how sincere, couldn't replace being present in the moment. The military had taught me that timing was everything in combat. The same principle applied to fatherhood, but I'd been too focused on external missions to understand that the card represented more than just a missed holiday. It was evidence of David's efforts to maintain our connection despite my physical absence, and my failure to create space for that connection when I was home. Even during leave periods, I was often mentally elsewhere, processing combat experiences. or preparing for the next deployment. I remembered that homecoming clearly. David had been polite but distant, going through the motions of welcoming me back without the genuine excitement of earlier returns. I'd attributed it to his growing maturity, to the natural evolution of a child who was becoming more independent. I hadn't realized he was protecting himself from disappointment. "How many other things like this are there?" I asked Sarah, holding the card carefully as if it might dissolve. "I don't know," she said. "He stopped talking about you as much after that deployment." Not in an angry way, just practically, like he was adjusting his expectations. The poem haunted me because it showed David trying so hard to understand and support my choices, even when those choices hurt him. He'd found ways to make sense of my absences, to frame them in terms of helping others and serving a greater good. But underneath that mature understanding was still a little boy who wanted his father to come to his baseball games and help with homework. I thought about all the conversations we'd never had, all the moments when David might have been reaching out, but I was too distracted to notice. Military life demanded constant vigilance, always preparing for the next mission or crisis. That mindset served me well in combat, but poorly as a father. The card also revealed David's emotional intelligence, even at 9. He understood that expressing his sadness about my absences might seem ungrateful or unpatriotic. So he'd buried those feelings beneath expressions of pride and understanding, teaching himself to cope with disappointment by not expecting too much in the first place. "Did he ever ask about giving it to me later?" I asked. "A few times in the weeks after you got back, but you were busy with debriefings and catching up at work. Eventually he just put it away." I tried to remember those first weeks home, but they were a blur of administrative tasks and readjustment. I'd been focused on transitioning back to garrison duty, on processing the experiences of deployment, on proving that I could still be effective despite the trauma I'd experienced. David's needs had been secondary to those pressing demands. The worst part was realizing that this pattern had repeated itself multiple times. How many other gestures of love had gone unnoticed or unreciprocated? How many times had David reached out only to find me emotionally unavailable? "I failed him," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the weight of the realization. "You were serving your country," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. We both knew that service could become an excuse for neglecting other responsibilities. That duty to nation didn't absolve us of duty to family. So were a lot of other fathers. Some of them managed to stay connected to their children. It was true. I'd known Marines who maintained close relationships with their families despite multiple deployments, who found ways to be present even when physically absent. They wrote letters, sent care packages, made video calls. They prioritized family, communication even when exhausted or stressed. I'd done some of those things, but inconsistently, without understanding how crucial they were to maintaining emotional connection. I'd treated family correspondence like another duty to be completed, rather than a lifeline to the people who mattered most. The card became a symbol of missed opportunities, of love offered that wasn't received, of a relationship that might have been different if I'd been more attentive to David's emotional needs. 9-year-old David had understood something that adult Michael had missed. Relationships require presence. Not just good intentions. I kept the card, placing it next to the drawing in my desk drawer. Together, they told the story of David's evolving relationship with me, from uncomplicated hero worship to the more complex reality of loving someone who wasn't always there when you needed them. Looking at that Father's Day card now, I can see it was a turning point. David had made one more attempt to connect with me, to express his love despite his disappointment. When that gesture went unreciprocated, not through malice but through my own emotional blindness, he began the process of protecting himself. By expecting less, the question that haunted me was whether it was too late to rebuild what we'd lost, whether an adult David could forgive the father who'd missed so many opportunities to show love in return. The broken picture frame still sits in the back of my closet, its glass spider-webbed from impact, but the photo inside miraculously intact. It shows our family at David's 8th grade graduation, all of us smiling for the camera, unaware that within an hour we'd be shouting at each other in our kitchen, The argument started over something trivial: David's plans for high school course selection. He wanted to focus on liberal arts and debate, while I pushed for more practical subjects like mathematics and science. What began as a discussion about academic planning quickly escalated into something much deeper and more painful. "You don't understand, Dad," David said, his voice carrying the particular frustration of a 14-year-old trying to assert independence. "I don't want to be an engineer or a doctor. I want to study history and literature." "Those subjects won't prepare you for the real world," I replied, falling back on the practical mindset that had served me well in the military. "You need skills that will provide financial security, like the military?" The question was loaded with teenage sarcasm, but underneath it was a genuine challenge to everything I represented. The military taught me discipline, leadership, and responsibility. It gave me a career and provided for this family. It also kept you away from this family for most of my childhood. The words hit harder than I'd expected. Sarah, who'd been quietly cleaning up after the graduation party, stopped what she was doing and turned to watch us. Emma, now 11, looked uncomfortable and started to leave the room. "Everything I did was for you and your sister," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Every deployment, every sacrifice was so you could have opportunities I never had." "I never asked you to sacrifice anything for me," David shouted back. "I would have rather had a father who was present than one who was off playing hero." The phrase "playing hero" was like a physical blow. It reduced everything I'd done, the deployments, the combat, the men I'd saved, to some kind of game or performance. It suggested that my service was about ego rather than duty, about personal glory rather than protecting others. "I wasn't playing anything," I said, my own voice rising to match his. "I was serving my country, protecting people like you who are free to stand there and criticize me because better men than you died defending that freedom." It was a low blow, invoking fallen comrades to win an argument with my teenage son. The moment I said it, I regretted it, but the words were already out there, hanging in the air between us like poisonous smoke. Better men than me? David's voice was quieter now, but more dangerous. "You mean men who chose duty over family? Men who cared more about strangers than their own children?" "David, that's enough," Sarah interjected, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further, but we were both beyond reason. 14 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding finally boiling over. David grabbed the framed graduation photo from the side table, not to throw it but to emphasize his point. But in his anger and my movement toward him, it slipped from his hands and crashed to the floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to snap us both back to reality. We stood there, staring at the damaged frame, the metaphor too obvious to ignore. Our family, like the picture, looked intact from a distance, but was actually fractured in ways that weren't immediately visible. "I hate this," David said, but he wasn't talking about the broken frame. "I hate pretending we're some perfect military family when we're not. I hate that everyone thinks you're this great hero when you can't even be a decent father." "David!" Sarah's voice was sharp with shock and disappointment. "No, Mom, it's true. He's never here when we need him, never really listens when we talk, and everyone acts like that's okay because he has medals. Well, I don't care about his medals. I care about having a dad who knows who I am." The accusation that I didn't know who he was stung because it contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. I knew David was intelligent, responsible, and, kind. I knew he excelled academically and had a small group of close friends. But did I know his dreams, his fears, his passions? Did I understand what made him laugh or what kept him awake at night? "I know exactly who you are," I said, though even as I spoke the words I realized how hollow they sounded. "Really? What's my favorite book? Who's my best friend? What do I want to do with my life? What am I afraid of?" David's questions came, rapid fire, and I found myself unable to answer any of them with confidence. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of Sarah picking up pieces of broken glass. Each question revealed another gap in my knowledge of my own son, another way I'd failed to pay attention to the person he was becoming. "Your favorite book is ... I started, then stopped. I'd seen him reading constantly, but had never asked about specific titles or what he enjoyed about them. Tom Sawyer, David said quietly. It's been Tom Sawyer since I was 10. You would know that if you'd ever bothered to ask. The fight went out of both of us then, replaced by a sadness that was somehow worse than anger. Anger suggested passion, conflict that might be resolved. Sadness suggested resignation, acceptance that things might never be different. I'm going to my room, David said, stepping carefully around the broken glass. And don't follow me. I need some time to think. After he left, Sarah and I cleaned up the mess in silence. The photo was undamaged, our smiling faces mocking the reality of what had just occurred. We looked like a happy family, the kind featured in military recruitment materials, but the broken frame told a different story. He's not wrong, you know, Sarah said as we finished cleaning, about not knowing him, about being absent even when you're here. I've done my best, I replied, though the words felt defensive and inadequate. I know you have. But your best has been focused on being a Marine, not on being a father. They're different skills, Michael, and you've only developed one of them. That night, I lay awake thinking about David's questions. What was his favorite book? Who was his best friend? What did he want to do with his life? The fact that I couldn't answer basic questions about my own son was a failure more profound than any military defeat. The broken frame became a symbol of our fractured relationship, evidence of the moment when years of accumulated distance finally exploded into open conflict. I kept it not as a reminder of the fight, but as a promise to myself that I'd find a way to repair what was broken, not just the frame, but the relationship it represented. But repair work requires understanding what went wrong in the first place, and that understanding was proving harder to achieve than any military objective I'd ever been given. The graduation photo from Harvard shows David in his cap and gown, standing between Sarah and Emma, their faces radiant with pride. I'm in the picture too, but standing slightly apart, as if I'm a guest at someone else's celebration rather than the father of the graduate. That physical distance in the photograph perfectly captured the emotional distance that had grown between us over the 4 years of David's college career. He'd excelled academically, graduated summa cum laude, and been accepted to Harvard Law School. By any objective measure, he was a remarkable young man who'd achieved everything I could have hoped for him, but none of those achievements felt shared. I'd learned about his academic successes through Sarah, heard about his plans secondhand, and celebrated his victories from a distance that felt impossible to bridge. The Harvard graduation was supposed to be a moment of family unity, a celebration that would bring us together despite our differences. I'd looked forward to it for months, imagining conversations about his future plans, his law school ambitions, his thoughts on the career that lay ahead of him. Instead, the weekend was marked by polite but distant interactions. David thanked me for coming, introduced me to his friends with careful politeness, and answered my questions with the kind of measured responses he might give to any interested adult. Dad, I'd like you to meet Professor Williams, he said at the reception after the ceremony. He's the one who wrote my recommendation letter for law school. Professor Williams shook my hand warmly, clearly impressed by David's achievements. Your son is remarkable. Mr. Harrison, one of the most thoughtful and articulate students I've had in 20 years of teaching. We're very proud of him, I replied, using the plural pronoun as if Sarah and I shared equal credit for David's success. But standing there, listening to Professor Williams describe my son's intellectual capabilities and character, I realized how little I'd contributed to the man David had become. His thoughtfulness, his articulation, his academic excellence, these were traits he'd developed despite my absences, not because of my influence. David tells me you're a decorated veteran, Professor Williams continued. Medal of Honor, if I'm not mistaken? Yes, sir, I replied, uncomfortable as always with the recognition. David's written some fascinating papers on military ethics and the laws of war. I suspect your service influenced his interest in those subjects. I looked at David, surprised. You've written about military ethics? Among other things, David replied, his tone neutral. It's an interesting area of study. But he didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The moment passed, and we moved on to other conversations. Other introductions, other polite exchanges that revealed nothing meaningful about our relationship. Later. At the family dinner that evening, I tried again to connect with David about his academic work, his plans for law school, his thoughts on the future. Professor Williams mentioned your papers on military ethics, I said as we waited for our food to arrive. I'd be interested in reading them sometime. They're pretty academic, David replied. Lots of footnotes and legal theory. Probably not very engaging for someone outside the field. The dismissal was gentle but clear. My son didn't think I was intellectually capable of understanding his work, or perhaps he simply didn't want to share it with me. Either possibility was painful. I might surprise you, I said, trying to keep my tone light. I've read a few books on military history and ethics over the years. I'm sure you have, David said, but there was no invitation in his voice. No suggestion that he wanted to explore the subject further. Sarah tried to bridge the gap, asking David about specific professors and courses, drawing him out in ways that came naturally to her. He responded warmly to her questions, his face lighting up as he described intellectual challenges and academic achievements. Watching their easy conversation, I felt like an outsider looking in on my own family. Sarah had maintained her connection with David throughout his college years, visiting him regularly, staying involved in his life in ways that I'd never managed to do. What about you, Dad? David asked suddenly, turning to me with what seemed like genuine interest. Are you planning to stay in the Marines much longer? It was the first personal question he'd asked me all weekend, and I found myself grateful for any sign of curiosity about my life. I'm considering retirement, I said. 27 years is a long career. Maybe it's time to try something different. Like what? I'm not sure yet. Teaching, maybe. Or working with veteran organizations. David nodded politely, but I could see that my answer didn't particularly interest him. My future plans were just conversation, not subjects he cared deeply about. The graduation photo was taken outside the law school, with the traditional backdrop of ivy-covered buildings and academic grandeur. David had arranged for a professional photographer, and we posed for several formal shots, as well as candid family pictures. Move in a little closer, Mr. Harrison, the photographer directed, but I felt awkward closing the distance to David. We'd grown accustomed to maintaining physical as well as emotional space, and proximity felt forced rather than natural. In the final shot, the one that would be framed and displayed in our living room, we're all smiling for the camera. But anyone who knew us well could see the subtle signs of distance, the way David's body angles slightly away from me, the careful positioning that keeps us from actually touching, the smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes when he looks in. My direction, that night in the hotel room Sarah and I shared, I looked through the digital photos on the camera's display. In every shot, the same pattern emerged. David close to his mother and sister, engaged and animated but maintaining careful distance from me. He's accomplished so much, Sarah said, looking over my shoulder at the pictures. Yes, he has, I agreed. No thanks to me. That's not true, Michael. Your sacrifices made his education possible. Your service gave him opportunities. My service gave him tuition money, I interrupted. But it didn't give him a father. There's a difference. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. It's not. Too late, to build something with him. But looking at those photographs, at the evidence of years of accumulated distance, I wondered if she was right. David was 22 years old, about to start law school. Well, on his way to building a life that didn't include much space for a father. He barely knew. The graduation photo sits on our mantel now, a testament to David's achievements and our family's support. But every time I look at it, I see the space between us. The physical manifestation of an emotional distance that I'd never learned how to bridge. That weekend marked the end of David's childhood and the beginning of his adult life. It should have been a moment of transition, an opportunity for our relationship to evolve into something new and different. Instead, it felt like a confirmation that the patterns established during his childhood would continue into his adult years. I'd missed my chance to be the father he needed when he was young. The question now was whether there was any way to become the father he might want as an adult. The classified report arrived on my desk 3 years after my retirement from the Marines. marked with security stamps and bureaucratic warnings about unauthorized disclosure. It was part of a routine declassification review, but seeing my name on the cover brought back memories I'd spent years trying to process. After Action Report, Operation Guardian Shield, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Read the title, followed by details that only I and a handful of others knew. This was the complete story of the incident that had earned me the Medal of Honor, not the sanitized version that appeared in citations and news articles, but the full, unredacted truth. I'd never seen the complete report before. Military investigations are compartmentalized, with different agencies examining different aspects of an incident. As the central figure, I've been interviewed extensively, but I'd never been given access to the broader analysis of what had happened that day. Reading it now, in the quiet of my study, I felt the same mixture of pride and guilt that had haunted me since Afghanistan. But this time, there were new details, perspectives I'd never considered, context that changed my understanding of my own actions. The report revealed that military intelligence had been tracking the Taliban offensive for weeks. They'd known the attack was coming, known the approximate strength of enemy forces, and known that my company would be the primary target. What they hadn't known was exactly when the assault would begin. More troubling was the revelation that reinforcements had been available but hadn't been deployed because of concerns about operational security. 3 companies of Marines had been positioned within helicopter range of our position, but command had decided that moving them might compromise other operations in the area. The decision to leave Guardian Company in position without immediate reinforcement was based on assessment that the unit could hold their position until artillery and air support could neutralize the threat, the report stated in clinical military language. In other words, my Marines and I had been used as bait. Our commanders had known we'd be attacked and had gambled that we could survive long enough for other assets to destroy the enemy force. It was sound tactical thinking from a strategic perspective, but it left a bitter taste when viewed from the ground level. The most devastating revelation came in the intelligence section of the report. The 14 Marines I'd rescued hadn't been trapped by accident. They'd been sent to that communications bunker as part of a deliberate plan to intercept enemy radio traffic. Command had known the bunker would be a target but had decided the intelligence value justified the risk. The sacrifice of personnel in the communications bunker was deemed acceptable given the potential intelligence value of intercepted enemy communications. The report noted with bureaucratic detachment. I read that sentence 3 times, trying to process its implications. The men I'd risked everything to save had been deliberately placed in danger as part of a larger operation. Their sacrifice had been planned, calculated, and deemed acceptable by officers who would never have to explain their decision to the families of dead Marines. The report went on to detail the aftermath of the battle. The intelligence gathered from intercepted communications had led to the capture of several high-value targets and the disruption of planned attacks across the region. From a strategic standpoint, the operation had been a complete success, but success had come at a cost that went beyond the obvious casualties. The psychological evaluation section of the report contained details about post-traumatic stress among the survivors, including my own struggles with guilt and hypervigilance. Several Marines had been medically retired due to psychological wounds, and one had committed suicide 6 months after returning home. Major Harrison's decision to attempt rescue of the communications team was tactically unsound but morally correct. The report concluded, his actions saved 14 lives at considerable risk to himself and his rescue team. However, the rescue was not necessary for mission success and may have compromised other operational objectives. The clinical language couldn't disguise the implications. According to official analysis, my Medal of Honor action had been a mistake, a well-intentioned, but tactically flawed decision that had interfered with larger strategic goals. I set the report down and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban neighborhood where Sarah and I had built our retirement. Children were playing in yards, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made military service seem worthwhile. Americans living free and safe because others were willing to fight for their security, but the report had shattered my understanding of That sacrifice, the 14 Marines I'd saved hadn't been innocent victims of enemy action, they'd been pawns in a larger game, placed in danger deliberately by their own commanders. My rescue of them hadn't been heroic, it had been insubordination, a refusal to accept that their lives were expendable. The weight of this knowledge was overwhelming. For years, I'd struggled with survivor's guilt and the burden of being called a hero for doing what felt like basic human decency. Now I learned that my actions had been officially deemed unnecessary, even counterproductive. I thought about David's words at dinner, anyone could have done what you did. Maybe he was right, but not in the way he'd meant. Anyone with access to the classified intelligence could have made the same calculated decision that my commanders had made, that 14 lives were an acceptable price for strategic advantage. What made my actions different wasn't special courage or exceptional skill. It was the refusal to accept that calculation, the insistence that those Marines were more than just expendable assets in a larger campaign. The report also explained something that had puzzled me for years: why the Medal of Honor recommendation had been processed so quickly, why there had been so little bureaucratic resistance to such a high-level decoration. Usually, Medal of Honor awards required extensive review and multiple levels of approval. But in this case, giving me the medal served multiple purposes. It transformed a potential scandal Marines deliberately placed in mortal danger into a story of heroism and sacrifice. It deflected attention from command decisions that might have been questioned if examined too closely. The award of the Medal of Honor to Major Harrison serves important institutional and public relations objectives. A memo attached to the report noted, "It provides positive press coverage during a difficult period in the conflict and demonstrates the Marine Corps' commitment to recognizing exceptional valor." I was a convenient hero, a feel-good story that made everyone forget about the uncomfortable questions surrounding the operation. The medal wasn't just recognition of my actions, it was a tool to shape the narrative, to ensure that the focus remained on individual courage rather than institutional failure. Reading this report 20 years later, I finally understood why I'd never felt comfortable with the hero label. On some unconscious level, I'd known that the official story didn't capture the complete truth. The real story wasn't about exceptional courage, it was about the moral complexity of command, decisions, and the human cost of strategic thinking. David had intuited something I'd been unable to articulate, that my Medal of Honor was as much about institutional needs as individual merit. He'd seen through the official narrative to something more complicated underneath. The classified report sits in my desk now, next to the drawing and the Father's Day card and all the other artifacts of my complicated relationship with service and family. It's a reminder that truth is often more complex than the stories we tell ourselves, and that even our most cherished beliefs about honor and duty might be built on foundations that won't withstand close examination. Maybe David's skepticism wasn't disrespect, maybe it was wisdom. The journal entries began during my recovery from Afghanistan, encouraged by therapists who insisted that writing might help process the trauma of combat. What started as clinical exercises in mental health became something more personal over the years. Letters to David that I never intended to send. Thoughts too complex for conversation, apologies too late for their intended purpose. Dear David, the first entry began, written on a yellow legal pad during my stay at Walter Reed. I know you don't understand why I chose the military, why I keep choosing it even when it takes me away from you and your sister. I wish I could explain it in a way that would make sense to a 10-year-old, but I'm not sure it makes sense to me anymore. The journal had filled 3 notebooks over the years, a running conversation with my absent son about duty, sacrifice, and the impossible balance between service to country and service to family. Each entry was dated, a record of my evolving understanding of fatherhood and the growing realization that I was failing at the most important mission of my life. I saw a boy today who reminded me of you, I'd written during my second Afghanistan deployment. He was maybe 8 or 9, selling water to Marines at a checkpoint. He had your serious expression, the way you look when you're trying to understand something complicated. I bought a bottle I didn't need just to see him smile. It made me miss your smile, David. I hope you still smile when I'm not there to see it. Reading through the entries now, I could trace the evolution of my regret. Early entries were focused on explaining myself, justifying my choices, helping an imaginary David understand why duty sometimes required sacrifice. Later entries became more introspective, questioning those choices, wondering if duty to country was worth the cost to family. Your mother tells me you won the science fair, I'd written when David was 12. She sent pictures and I can see the pride on your face standing next to your project on renewable energy. I wanted to call and congratulate you, but it was the middle of the night where you are, and by the time I remembered to call the next day, the moment had passed. I'm good at missing moments, David. It's becoming one of my specialties. The journal revealed the pattern of my failures with painful clarity. Good intentions derailed by operational demands. Promises broken by emergency deployments. Conversations postponed until they were no longer relevant. Each entry was a small confession, an acknowledgement of another opportunity missed. I wonder if you think about me when I'm gone, I'd written during a particularly difficult period in Helmand Province. Your mother says you ask about me, worry about my safety, but you never talk to me directly about those concerns. Maybe you've learned not to invest too much emotion in someone who might not come home. That would be smart, tactically speaking, but it breaks my heart to think you've had to develop that kind of emotional armor at such a young age. Some entries were written in anger, frustration with a son I couldn't understand and who seemed equally unable to understand me. You act like my service is a personal affront to you, I'd written after one of our arguments, like I chose the Marines to spite you rather than to provide for you. I wish you could see the men I serve with, the sacrifices they make, the good we do in the world. But maybe that's asking too much of a teenager who just wants his father to come to his baseball games. Others were written in deep sadness, recognizing the cost of choices I'd felt compelled to make. I missed your birthday again, I'd written from Afghanistan. Your mother sent pictures of the party, and you look happy surrounded by friends. But I can't help noticing that when people ask about your father, you change the subject. I'm becoming an embarrassment to you, or maybe just an irrelevance. I'm not sure which is worse. The most recent entries, written after reading the classified report, reflected a new understanding of my service and its impact on my family. I always told myself that my deployments were about duty, about serving something greater than myself, I'd written just weeks ago. But maybe they were also about avoiding the harder work of being present for my family. Combat is complicated, but the rules are clear. Fatherhood is messier, more ambiguous, and I never learned to navigate it successfully. The journal contained apologies I'd never been able to speak aloud, acknowledgments of failure that seemed too painful to voice directly. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, I'd written repeatedly, in various forms. I'm sorry I didn't know how to talk to you when I was there. I'm sorry I'd tried to make you into something you weren't instead of appreciating who you are. But it also contained observations about David that revealed how much I'd actually noticed, despite my apparent emotional absence. You have your mother's empathy, but your own unique sense of justice, I'd written when he was 15. You can't stand to see anyone treated unfairly, even people you don't particularly like. Yesterday you defended a kid at school who was being bullied, even though it meant missing lunch. Your mother told me about it with such pride, and I felt proud too, but also sad that I heard about your courage secondhand. The journal entries showed a father trying to understand his son from a distance, piecing together information from Sarah's reports and brief interactions, attempting to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with each passing year. They revealed love that couldn't find expression, regret that deepened with time, and a growing understanding that good intentions weren't enough to repair damage done by absence and emotional unavailability. I know I can't undo the years of missing your life, I'd written in one of the most recent entries, but maybe I can try to understand why I missed it. And maybe that understanding will help me figure out how to be present for whatever years we have left together. You're 25 now, David, building your own life, and I'm still trying to figure out how to be your father. It may be too late for the relationship we should have had, but maybe it's not too late for the relationship we could still have. The journal represented hundreds of hours of one-sided conversation, thoughts shared with an imaginary David who was more patient and forgiving than the real one. It was evidence of love that had struggled to find appropriate expression, of a father who'd been more emotionally present on paper than in person. Sitting in my study now, surrounded by all the artifacts of my complicated relationship with my son, I realized that the journal entries might be the most honest communication I'd ever had about fatherhood. They contained truths I'd never been able to speak aloud, insights that had taken years to develop, and acknowledgments of failure that might be the beginning of wisdom. The question was whether any of those truths would matter to David now, whether years of written apologies could somehow compensate for decades of missed opportunities, or whether, like the unopened Father's Day card, they would remain gestures of love that arrived too late to matter. But maybe timing wasn't everything. Maybe the act of finally understanding my own failures was worth something, even if it couldn't repair the damage they'd caused. Maybe honesty, however delayed, was still better than the careful distance we'd maintained for so many years. I picked up a pen and began writing a new entry, but this time with a different purpose. This time I was writing to David not as an absent father making excuses, but as a man who'd finally learned to see clearly. "Dear David," I began, "I've been writing to you for years without having the courage to actually speak to you. I think it's time that changed. I have things to tell you about my service, about the choices I made, about the man I became and the father I failed to be. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope for understanding. And maybe, if I'm very lucky, I hope for a chance to try again." I signed the entry with my name and the date, then closed the journal. For the first time in years, I knew what I had to do. The conversation I'd been avoiding, the honesty I'd been afraid to risk, the vulnerability I'd been too proud to show, it was time to stop writing to David and start talking to him. The journal had taught me that some truths are too important to remain unspoken, even when speaking them requires admitting failure. Especially then. The letters I'd never sent were about to become the conversation. I'd never had the courage to begin. It was time to find out if 25 years of accumulated distance could be bridged by the simple act of telling the truth. The new family photo sits on our mantel now, replacing the graduation picture that had shown so much distance between us. This one was taken last month at Emma's wedding, and the difference is striking. David and I stand next to each other, genuine smiles on our faces, my arm around his shoulders in a gesture that would have been impossible just a year ago. But the photo represents the end of a journey, not the beginning. Getting to that moment required the most difficult conversation of my life, one that began 3 days after that painful dinner when David had dismissed my Medal of Honor. I'd called him at his apartment, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. "David, it's Dad. I was wondering if we could talk. Not about careers or politics or anything practical, just ... There was a long pause before he answered. "About what?" "About Afghanistan, about what really happened there, about why your words the other night hurt so much." Another pause. "Dad, I didn't mean to." "No, you did mean it, and you were right to say it." "That's what I want to talk about." We met at a coffee shop near his apartment, neutral ground where neither of us had to feel like we were on the defensive. David arrived first, looking nervous and uncertain, probably expecting another lecture about respect and military service. Instead, I sat across from him and said the words I'd been practicing for days. "I need to tell you about the day I earned the Medal of Honor and why I've never been comfortable being called a hero." For the next 2 hours, I told him everything. About the classified report, about the 14 Marines who'd been deliberately placed in danger, about the command decisions that had treated human lives as acceptable losses. I told him about the nightmares, the guilt, the way the medal had always felt like a burden rather than an honor. "I saved those men not because I was brave," I said, "but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. The alternative wasn't acceptable, no matter what the tactical situation demanded." David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like respect. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. "Because you deserve to know who your father really is. Not the hero from the citations, but the man who's been struggling with the weight of That recognition for 20 years. You're still a hero, Dad, maybe more of one than I realized. I'm a man who made one decent choice in an impossible situation. That doesn't make me a hero, it makes me human. That conversation opened a door that had been closed for years. David began asking questions about my service, about the decisions I'd made, about the experiences that had shaped me. Not from curiosity about military tactics, but from genuine interest in understanding his father. I always thought your service was about duty and honor and all those abstract concepts, he said during one of our follow-up conversations. I never understood that it was about protecting specific people, making choices that had real consequences for real families. I never knew how to explain that to you, I admitted. I thought the abstract concepts were easier to understand than the human reality. But the human reality is what matters, isn't it? The 14 Marines who went home to their families. The choice to value their lives over tactical advantage. Yes, I thought. That was exactly what mattered. Our conversations became regular. Weekly coffee meetings where we talked about everything we'd never discussed before. I learned about his work at the law firm, his passion for civil rights cases, his plans to eventually start his own practice focused on veterans advocacy. You inspired that, he told me one afternoon. Not the hero stuff, but the idea that some things are worth fighting for even when it's difficult. I thought I'd failed to inspire you at all. You inspired me to think critically about authority, to question whether official narratives tell the whole story. That served me well in law. I realized then that my influence on David had been more profound than I'd understood, just not in the ways I'd expected. He'd learned from my example, but he'd also learned from my failures, developing his own moral compass partly in response to what he'd observed in me. I'm sorry I wasn't there more when you were growing up, I said during one of our conversations. I'm sorry I didn't know how to be present even when I was physically home. I'm sorry I didn't understand what you were carrying, he replied. I thought your distance was about not caring. I never considered that it might be about caring too. Much. The new family photo captures the result of months of these conversations. David and I look comfortable together, father and son who finally learned to see each other clearly. The physical closeness represents emotional intimacy that took decades to develop but now feels natural and sustainable. You know what I realized? David said as we looked at the photo together after Emma's wedding. You did teach me something important about heroism. You taught me that real heroes don't seek recognition. They just do what needs to be done and live with the consequences. What made you realize that? The way you've handled the medal all these years. The way you've never used it for personal advantage, never let it define you. The way you've carried the weight of it without complaint. I looked at the photo again, at the evidence of a relationship rebuilt through honesty and mutual respect. I wish I'd learned how to talk to you about these things when you were younger. Maybe I wouldn't have been ready to hear them then. Maybe. We both needed to grow into the people we are now before we could have these conversations. He was probably right. The David who dismissed my service at 25 had been reacting to years of distance and misunderstanding. The David who stood beside me in the new photo was a man who'd learned to see complexity in situations that had once seemed simple. I'm proud of you, I told him, words that felt long overdue. Not just for your accomplishments, but for the man you've become. For your compassion, your integrity, your willingness to fight for what's right. I'm proud of you too, Dad, for the choice you made in Afghanistan, for the way you've handled the recognition, for having the courage to tell me the truth even when it was difficult. The new family photo represents more than reconciliation. It represents understanding. David and I have both learned that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about making difficult choices and living with their consequences. We've learned that love doesn't require agreement, but it does require honesty. Most importantly, we've learned that it's never too late to begin again, to build something new on the foundation of truth rather than the shifting sand of unexamined assumptions. The photo will remain on our mantle, a reminder that some distances can be bridged and some relationships can be healed, but only through the difficult work of seeing each other clearly and accepting what we find there. The new family photo sits on our mantle now, replacing the graduation picture that had shown so much distance between us. This one was taken last month at Emma's wedding, and the difference is striking. David and I stand next to each other, genuine smiles on our faces, my arm around his shoulders in a gesture that would have been impossible just a year ago, but the photo represents the end of a journey, not the beginning. Getting to that moment required the most difficult conversation of my life, one that began 3 days after that painful dinner when David had dismissed my Medal of Honor. I'd called him at his apartment, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. "David, it's Dad. I was wondering if we could talk." Not about careers or politics or anything practical, just talk. There was a long pause before he answered. "About what?" "About Afghanistan. About what really happened there. About why your words the other night hurt so much." Another pause. "Dad, I didn't mean to." "No, you did mean it, and you were right to say it." "That's what I want to talk about." We met at a coffee shop near his apartment, neutral ground where neither of us had to feel like we were on the defensive. David arrived first, looking nervous and uncertain, probably expecting another lecture about respect and military service. Instead, I sat across from him and said the words I'd been practicing for days. "I need to tell you about the day I earned the Medal of Honor and why I've never been comfortable being called a hero." For the next 2 hours, I told him everything. About the classified report, about the 14 Marines who'd been deliberately placed in danger, about the command decisions that had treated human lives as acceptable losses. I told him about the nightmares, the guilt, the way the medal had always felt like a burden rather than an honor. "I saved those men not because I was brave," I said, "but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." The alternative wasn't acceptable, no matter what the tactical situation demanded. David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like respect. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. "Because you deserve to know who your father really is. Not the hero from the citations, but the man who's been struggling with the weight of that recognition for 20 years. You're still a hero, Dad, maybe more of one than I realized. I'm a man who made one decent choice in an impossible situation. That doesn't make me a hero, it makes me human." That conversation opened a door that had been closed for years. David began asking questions about my service, about the decisions I'd made, about the experiences that had shaped me. Not from curiosity about military tactics, but from genuine interest in understanding his father. "I always thought your service was about duty and honor and all those abstract concepts," he said during one of our follow-up conversations. "I never understood that it was about protecting specific people, making choices that had real consequences for real families." "I never knew how to explain that to you," I admitted. "I thought the abstract concepts were easier to understand than the human reality." "But the human reality is what matters, isn't it? The 14 Marines who went home to their families. The choice to value their lives over tactical advantage." "Yes," I thought. That was exactly what mattered. Our conversations became regular. Weekly coffee meetings where we talked about everything we'd never discussed before. I learned about his work at the law firm, his passion for civil rights cases, his plans to eventually start his own practice focused on veterans advocacy. "You inspired that, he told me one afternoon. "Not the hero stuff, but the idea that some things are worth fighting for even when it's difficult." I thought I'd failed to inspire you at all. "You inspired me to think critically about authority, to question whether official narratives tell the whole story. That served me well in law." I realized then that my influence on David had been more profound than I'd understood, just not in the ways I'd expected. He'd learned from my example, but he'd also learned from my failures, developing his own moral compass partly in response to what he'd observed in me. "I'm sorry I wasn't there more when you were growing up," I said during one of our conversations. "I'm sorry I didn't know how to be present even when I was physically home." "I'm sorry I didn't understand what you were carrying," he replied. "I thought your distance was about not caring." I never considered that it might be about caring too. Much. The new family photo captures the result of months of these conversations. David and I look comfortable together, father and son who finally learned to see each other clearly. The physical closeness represents emotional intimacy that took decades to develop but now feels natural and sustainable. You know what I realized? David said as we looked at the photo together after Emma's wedding, "You did teach me something important about heroism. You taught me that real heroes don't seek recognition, they just do what needs to be done and live with the consequences." What made you realize that? The way you've handled the medal all these years. The way you've never used it for personal advantage, never let it define you. The way you've carried the weight of it without complaint. I looked at the photo again, at the evidence of a relationship rebuilt through honesty and mutual respect. I wish I'd learned how to talk to you about these things when you were younger. Maybe I wouldn't have been ready to hear them then. Maybe we both needed to grow into the people we are now before we could have these conversations. He was probably right. The David who dismissed my service at 25 had been reacting to years of distance and misunderstanding. The David who stood beside me in the new photo was a man who'd learned to see complexity in situations that had once seemed simple. "I'm proud of you," I told him, words that felt long overdue. "Not just for your accomplishments, but for the man you've become. For your compassion, your integrity, your willingness to fight for what's right. I'm proud of you too, Dad, for the choice you made in Afghanistan. For the way you've handled the recognition, for having the courage to tell me the truth even when it was difficult." The new family photo represents more than reconciliation, it represents understanding. David and I have both learned that heroism isn't about being perfect. It's about making difficult choices and living with their consequences. We've learned that love doesn't require agreement, but it does require honesty. Most importantly, we've learned that it's never too late to begin again, to build something new on the foundation of truth rather than the shifting sand of unexamined assumptions. The photo will remain on our mantle, a reminder that some distances can be bridged and some relationships can be healed, but only through the difficult work of seeing each other clearly and accepting what we find there.